all of a sudden I forgot, what time am I supposed to end? And last week I had the same feeling, and my friend introduced me, and he's like, oh, my friend Kent, blah, blah, blah. And then he came to give me a hug, and he was like, end at 10:55. I was like, anyway, I think I'll be all right. I wanted to talk about peace, and I wanted to talk about the shadow, peace in the shadow, which is not the easiest territory to venture into. And what a fitting conversation to have this morning around peace. I mean, did you know it was the International Day of Peace this week? I mean, the irony was just rich. And I was thinking about, I heard something on the news. They were calling Trump and Kim Jong-un. They were saying they were saber rattling, which I thought is an interesting image, and a very old image, a very, very old image. There was a time when there was such a thing. And maybe it was a way of saying, I'm willing to draw my sword. But to draw your sword and stand in front of another human being is one thing. The kind of sabers that we are rattling, there's not a one-to-one connection. When we're talking about pushing buttons that can destroy villages and cities and countries and civilizations off the face of the earth. Not to mention the earth itself. So we live in an incredible time. And so a conversation about peace seems maybe a matter of life and death. And it's really hard to even know how to get going. The conversation about peace, because we're not just talking about war or the absence of war, as Wayne was saying. We're talking about economic uncertainty, and we're talking about health care. We have little health and very little care. These are all conditions or elements or ingredients, might be a better word, for peace. And even if we don't try to define peace, we know it's not just one thing. It's a complex web. So how do we talk about all these things at one time? What is peace? What is peace in our country? What is peace? And how does one move towards such a thing? Those are just questions I have, and I don't really have answers for them. I was thinking about peace at what cost? And I heard something on the radio that disturbed me. And it was just a fact, not a fake news fact, but an actual fact. It was someone was saying that in the United States, there are more people in prison in the United States than any country on earth. I thought, And what do we tell ourselves? We tell ourselves that we are a country that is free. It's a country of freedom. So there might be something we want to look at in that kind of juxtaposition. And we want to export such freedom to others, interestingly enough. So I'm not really trying to make a political statement on purpose. I'm just sort of stating, I'm trying to look at what's real. Actually, that's part of getting close to a conversation about peace, is trying to get to a conversation about what's true. What is really true? What's really going on? And what am I a part of? Because I'm really good at distancing myself from all kinds of things. So what am I a part of, and how am I a part of that? And then I was thinking about religious language as having some clues. For example, I'll test you right now. So I'll test you to see how Christian you are or once were. Okay. So here's the test. You ready? Ready? So you're gonna say something after I say something. You ready? Peace be with you. Okay. See. Yeah. So a lot of religious hangovers in the room today. Okay. So why do we say such a thing? Because it's actually quite a beautiful thing. Peace be with you, and also with you. It's not so abstract. Like it's not like peace out there. We're speaking to another person. And I was even thinking about the way Jews and Arabs greet one another in Israel, which is very interesting. So in Hebrew you would say shalom, and in Arabic you would say salam alaikum, which how lovely. I mean, it's kind of, it opens up a kind of door into the heart, such a greeting. Now you could say, oh, it's the same thing as saying hi. I don't think it's the same thing as saying hi. There's a kind of longing. There's a kind of longing in language like that for what's possible and for sometimes what's there, for what's absent. And we need a world where more people are saying shalom to one another rather than rattling their nuclear sabers and calling one another names you would hear on the playground, you know. So it's sad. You can't even say the word sad anymore without it having some kind of reference. Oh my. Okay. So here's a story. So maybe you've heard the story about there's a Zen master, and he's coming home one day. And it's late. He's been out doing Zen things. And it's way after dark. And he's following the path home, and he's getting near his house, and he comes to a street lamp. And he kind of, is looking for his keys to get in the house, and passes by the street lamp and goes up to the house. And he's fiddling in his little satchel and realizes he can't find his keys. And he looks around, still can't find his keys. So he closes his satchel and begins to look around all over. He's looking on the steps. He's looking on the sidewalk. He's looking all around where this street lamp is, and his friend comes by, and he says, "What are you doing?" He's like, "I lost my keys. And it's the only key I have. And if I can't find this key, I can't get into my house." The friend says, "Well, I'll help you." So the two of them, they're searching diligently all over, looking under the bushes, looking behind trees, looking all around where the street light is, near the stairs by his house, on the sidewalk. And eventually his friend says, "I think we've looked everywhere. Are you sure you dropped your keys underneath this lamp?" He says, "No, I dropped them out there in the darkness." So this is a story about shadowy stuff. We tend to look for things in the light, under the street lamp, in places that we're familiar. So we want to fix the world, we think, and so we look under the street light using solutions that we already know all about. Or we're looking for the key to the next dimension of our growth, but we're looking in the same areas that we've always looked. But the key is out there in the shadow somewhere. The key is out there in the darkness where we don't want to go. And we know it and we don't know it at the same time. So there's something about peace and the longing for it, the key to which is in the darkness. That's my question. I'm giving it as a statement, but it's more like a question. And I'm thinking of Jung. So, first of all, I want to talk about the shadow. I want to tell you I'm not a psychotherapist. I'm not an expert, okay? I'm more curious than anything else. And so this is what Jung says about the shadow, which kind of makes me laugh, but like in a weird way. He's like, the shadow is what you don't know about yourself. So how are you going to have a conversation about something you don't know about yourself? It's, to use the image again, it's the territory that you have yet to venture in, out beyond the street lamp. It's there, and one part of you know the key's over there, but you don't want to go and venture over there. So the shadow is what we don't know about ourselves. Now, and shadow is, in Jungian thought, is neither good nor bad. There are sinister qualities to the shadow, and there are golden qualities to the shadow, both of which remain out there beyond the confines of the street lamp. In other words, your greatest capacities for beauty, art, life, living, the seed of which you are to bring forth in the world, there's some component of it that you don't yet know about. And there are also some sinister things that for sure you're convinced don't apply to you, that are somewhere out there in the shadow. In fact, it's one way of sort of detecting that you're getting close enough to the shadow is that you flatly deny being anything like fill in the blank. So if you hear me saying there is absolutely no way I am anything like fill in the blank, you can be pretty sure I'm like that. That you're getting close. That you're beginning to venture out to the edge of the light of the street lamp, and you're heading out toward the shadows. So those are some of the things I want to talk about. And I just have a kind of intuition that if our world is going to become more healthy, more whole, more compassionate, or if you take the values that are on the back of the C3 bulletin, if the world is going to look a little bit more like that, there are some clues in the darkness that we're going to have to go and recover ourselves. In other words, I think there's something about shadow and the possibility for deeper change in the world. And even like everyone likes to quote Gandhi, including me. I probably already quoted him since being here. Who knows? Be the change you want to see in the world. And everyone's like, oh, that feels so good. Yeah, that's it. Except we don't want to do the very first word in there. Be the change. In other words, you can't put it on anyone else. That's what Gandhi is saying. Be the change you want to see in the world. How does one be that? Not by strong-arming others to be the change in the world. So that's the invitation, is more of an inner journey. So what is peace in the world? It's external. There are things you can do. You can vote for a more peaceful world. You can, actually. We can change laws that will help. Correct? But that still doesn't necessarily mean in our hearts we are being the change we want to see in the world. Correct? So maybe it's a both and. Today I'm more interested in the inner journey, into this territory. I was thinking about Trump, and I was thinking about Clinton. And remember when they were running against one another? And I was like in the middle of the election, I was into all this like psycho-spiritual stuff, and I'm reading Jung and all this stuff, and it's just driving me nuts. And it was funny because I think the rhetoric on both sides was quite revealing. So on the one hand, you have Trump using certain language like crooked, right? Crooked, and liar. He loved to call Hillary a liar, which is another way of, we can all say from the outside, you're simply calling her what you are, we would say. But that's actually, I'm talking about the caricature of Trump. I've never had a beer with him. We've never sat down. I don't know what he's really like. But there was something about that kind of language and the particular venom that it had that seemed to be like the sort of thing I'm talking about. If it's over there, it's not in me. And also, I think the same is true the other way around. I remember when Hillary, she had a kind of like edge sometimes when she would say that Donald Trump was unfit for the presidency. And I thought to myself, is that a factual statement? Probably. But, but it was just the tone. And there probably, if I were to unfairly analyze the situation, there may have been some component in her that also felt unfit. Because who of us would not feel unfit for such a thing? Especially if you're a politician like Hillary and have been one your whole life. You don't think there have been some backroom deals? Yeah. So this kind of name calling we see on a big scale right now in our culture. And I think, what is it pointing out? It's pointing out that it's so much easier to scapegoat, blame, point the finger, categorize, and dismiss other people so that we don't have to be the change we want to see in the world. It's much easier to say so-and-so is the problem. And it doesn't mean that they're not a problem. They may be. But that's not exactly the invitation on the inner level, is what I'm talking about. Richard Rohr likes to say, he's a Franciscan priest, he likes to say, what is not transformed is transmitted. Or you could even say is transferred. So what is not transformed or transforming in us, you simply transmit to someone else. They are the problem, which is a lot of fun, by the way. I really like scapegoating and blaming people. It makes me feel really good for about 5 minutes. I was thinking about racism, too. And I'll tell you something. I hope you don't fire me after saying this, but the other day it was actually last year, I met a friend downtown, and he owned a restaurant. It was closed. It was late at night, and I had to go in just for not for too long to move some things. And I left my car outside, and I went in, and I turned, and I saw like an African American walking sort of toward my car. So I locked it, right? And I didn't have a conscious thought. I didn't think, I'm going to lock my car. It was more of an instinct. Now you can say, like afterwards, you might come up to me and try to make me feel better by saying, well, you know, we live in times where it's dangerous to leave your car unlocked or whatever. You were doing the smart thing, the wise thing, the rational thing. But I got very curious about this, and I thought to myself, why did I do that? Because if it was, let's say, some sort of blonde fraternity girl stumbling out of a bar, would I have locked the car? Now, I don't know the answer to that question. You all do, apparently. So what is going on there? I think when it comes to race, and a lot of people don't like to even talk about this or admit it, that there are some pretty deep roots there. And actually, the neuroscience suggests that even as infants, little infants will prefer skin tone and facial shapes that are like their own. In other words, there's a little bit of biology, limbic brain, fight or flight, who's like me, who's not, that is behind or a part of or an ingredient in some of that stuff. But we don't want to look at it at all. I certainly don't. I don't want to look at the fact that even some of my own instincts might be a bit unsavory, a bit sinister. Now, the amazing thing about shadow work is once you start to absorb it, or actually what Robert Bly, the poet, says, when your shadow creeps up, the invitation is to eat it, to consume it, to say, there it is. I'll give you a great example of it. You know what Churchill used to say? He used to say, I have had to eat many of my words. Now think about, by the way, a world leader saying that right now. I have had to eat many of my words. And this is what he said after that. He said, and I found the diet very nourishing. See, that's someone, honestly, who has eaten a little bit more of their shadowy bits. Yeah, I've found some of the things that I've done and said a bit embarrassing. Instead of suppressing them and denying them, I'm going to eat them. Yeah, I'm like that sometimes. That's humiliating. But the moment you move toward that, some other door starts to open up. And actually, the world suddenly looks a whole lot less divisive. I can no longer say, you are nothing like me, right? I can no longer say, there's no way I would do that. Well, maybe I too have the capacity for such things. It's not about the same thing as saying I definitely would. I think it's much more about capacity. That being a human being is pretty complex. So the kind of invitation I'm talking about is to venture out beyond the street lamp into these more unsavory bits. And I was thinking about Trump. I was just imagining, what if Trump were to say something like this to Kim Jong-un? I know this is like, you can't even imagine this, but just try to imagine it. What if he were to say, you know, the United States has nuclear weapons, and I inherited these. I inherited the stockpile. I did. I didn't make the decisions to make them, but here I am, and I'm in this position. And I'm afraid of my own capacity to abuse power. I'm afraid of my own capacity to abuse power. So I also am afraid of your capacity to abuse power. That's why I want to resist the acquiring of more nuclear weapons. Now, that sounds like no one would ever say that, correct? No world leader would ever say that, but I'm telling you, that kind of thing is what shadow work opens up. Because if you can't see it, let's put it on Trump and them, because it's easier to put it on them. If Trump can't see his own capacity to make poor decisions and abuse power, there's no deeper peace that's going to open up. And that's what's funny about nuclear weapons. This always struck me funny when I was a kid. We used to say, you can't have them. We can have them, but you can't have them. That's like, you know, a parent that says, you can't smoke weed. And then, like, you find out on the weekends they smoke weed. You're like, wait a minute. This doesn't make any sense. How can you tell me not to? Well, you have to understand. Now I'm playing world leaders. You have to understand that we're moral, and moral people can have nuclear weapons. But you're kind of immoral, and you can't handle nuclear weapons. What country on earth is going to say, you know what, you're right? What was I thinking? You know? Now, all that sounds like a pipe dream, that world leaders would talk to one another that way. Except it's not. That's the hopeful side of what I'm talking about. And we have a whole generation of kids growing up right now that I hope will see the ironies, inconsistencies, and absurdities of the world situation and walk out beyond the limits of their own street light, absorb and eat some of this stuff, and walk out into the possibility of a world where there's more compassion. The only way that I know forward is to take it on personally. I can't, unfortunately, send Trump an email and say, you know, you need a Jungian analyst. And I think you need to do some shadow work. But I can. And you can. And this community can. And that is the invitation that's before us. In what ways will we walk toward this is what I'm kind of asking. It means, I think, We can't have too lofty or too low of a view of our own humanity. We can't march around in moral superiority, and I don't think we can march around with our heads too low either. So here's some Wallace Stevens. Here's a little line from one of his poems. The imperfect is our paradise. The imperfect is our paradise. And in the question time before, we started talking about the Puritans. And we were talking about the collective shadow, which is a whole nother conversation. But, in our own roots as Americans, we have this kind of collective belief that actually we're the good guys. And some of that comes right out of the Puritan ideology. Well, obviously we have the right to be here. We're the good people. God likes us. And everything else that we don't like, we're going to expel or burn at the stake or cover up like skin. And we're going to say that's not us. Women, the devil, witches, Indians, Native Americans, all those people will push out. Well, that is part of our own ideology that we've inherited just by virtue of the fact of being a part of this country. So it's something that I think we're being invited in a very fresh way right now at this moment in history to look again at. Which doesn't sound like which Wallace Stevens, I think, it sounds so counterintuitive here. The imperfect is our paradise. We think, no. The paradise is the perfection. Get all the evil, shadowy bits away from us. He's saying, no, the imperfect. Let's embrace it. So he goes on, the imperfect is our paradise. Note that in this bitterness, delight. I hear such humility in that. The imperfect is our paradise. And note that in this bitterness, it's a hard pill to swallow. In other words, there's some delight. Our own inconsistencies and imperfections become something that's tasty. Since the imperfect is so hot in us, that's someone who's ventured out beyond the street lamp. Since the imperfect is so hot in us, lies in flawed words and stubborn sounds. In other words, the clues are in the little fumblings that slip out from time to time. So I guess that's what I'm hovering around today, this kind of imperfect paradise. And this kind of return, I think, to a more sober view of what it means to be a human being, and to turn our attention, I think, to our own unsavory bits, and perhaps even to our own golden bits, although that's maybe a different talk for a different time. And I was thinking about all this stuff, and all of a sudden I thought of a line from Jesus that I have never understood. And believe me, I went to graduate school for this kind of stuff. And this one line, I never really got it for some reason, or it never struck me in a way that felt both true and personal. So listen to what Jesus says. I put it in the bulletin. When your eye is bad, your whole body is filled with darkness. In other words, the way you see stuff, the way you see it is the way you see it. If your eyes are bad, your whole body is filled with darkness. He says, and if the light you think you have is actually darkness, how deep is that darkness? I think Jesus saw a Jungian analyst. I bet no one has ever said that. Yeah. And that's what you have going on in so much of our culture. The eye is bad, but we're calling it light. The eye is bad, but we're saying, no, but we see the light. So what's the invitation? To clean the lens. The eye has to work both ways. It has to see out and it has to see in. If there's such thing as a double-sided eye, that's what I think Jesus is talking about. And I think that's the invitation for us. So I think there are a lot of things we want to be pointing out in our culture and say, no, we don't want to go along with this. But let's also, as best we can, turn that inner eye toward our own shadowy bits and say, in what way am I like this too? Because guess what? Two sides who both feel morally superior create a very dangerous world. So I'll end with this reading one more time. But when your eye is bad, your whole body is filled with darkness. And if the light you think you have is actually darkness, how deep that darkness is. Thanks for listening.